Imagine closing your eyes in perfect health and opening them to find death already claiming your body. That was the reality for millions in the 1300s, when an invisible enemy swept across continents with such ferocity that witnesses believed they were watching the final chapter of human existence. This wasn't mere disease, it was annihilation on a scale that defies comprehension, a biological cataclysm that would consume up to 200 million souls and fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization. The terror began not with warning signs or gradual spread, but with sudden, brutal finality. Victims would notice painful lumps forming beneath their arms and along their throats, swellings that turned black as night. Fever consumed them. Within a span of days, sometimes mere hours, entire households would cease to exist. The speed was paralyzing, the certainty absolute. No social class offered protection, no prayer provided salvation, no treatment brought relief. What made this catastrophe particularly devastating was timing. Medieval Europe had reached unprecedented heights of prosperity and interconnection. The early 1400s represented the pinnacle of achievement for medieval society, a period historians call the High Middle Ages. Population had exploded across the continent, nearly doubling over 2 centuries, thanks to favorable climate patterns that delivered abundant harvests year after year. Cities bulged beyond their ancient defensive walls. Paris, Venice, Florence, and London teemed with humanity, packed into narrow streets and multi-story dwellings. Magnificent cathedrals soared toward heaven, testaments to both faith and engineering prowess that would have astounded earlier generations. But the true revolution was invisible, woven through trade routes that spanned the known world. The Mongol Empire had created something extraordinary, a zone of protected commerce stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, the Pax Mongolica. Merchants could transport silk, spices, precious metals, and revolutionary ideas across thousands of miles through secure networks. Venice operated as the western terminus of this medieval internet, where exotic goods from distant Asia arrived to fuel European appetites. This interconnected prosperity, however, contained the seeds of catastrophe. The same caravans and vessels that delivered wealth also carried something far more deadly, something that would exploit every trade route, every port, every crowded marketplace with ruthless efficiency. The stage was perfectly set for disaster on an unprecedented scale. Deep in Central Asia, in regions that now comprise Kyrgyzstan and northern China, a microscopic killer had existed for countless generations. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium of extraordinary lethality, lived within populations of steppe rodents, marmots, and ground squirrels that inhabited the vast grasslands. For centuries, this pathogen maintained ecological balance with its hosts, far removed from major human settlements. But ecological disruption in the 1330s changed everything. Climate stress, possibly severe drought followed by torrential flooding, devastated rodent food supplies. Hunger drove infected animals toward human trading posts along the Silk Road. The first human victims likely died confused and terrified, unable to comprehend the agonizing swellings and high fevers consuming them. Word traveled slowly in that era, but rumors of catastrophe moved faster than any caravan. By the early 1340s, fragmented reports reached Mediterranean ports describing entire Eastern civilizations vanishing, of pestilence that had depopulated India, Mesopotamia, and vast stretches of Asia. Europeans heard these accounts with distant horror, viewing them as tragedies befalling foreign lands, perhaps divine punishment for alien beliefs. They possessed no concept of contagion, no understanding that the spices flavoring their meals traveled the same routes as their doom. The geographical linchpin of this catastrophe was Kaffa, a fortified Genoese colony on the Crimean Peninsula jutting into the Black Sea. This wasn't merely a trading outpost, but a magnificent walled city, extraordinarily wealthy, serving as the critical junction connecting overland Asian routes to Mediterranean maritime networks. Within its massive fortifications lived Italian merchants, Armenian traders, and a cosmopolitan mixture of peoples defended by Genoese crossbowmen. In 1346, Kaffa found itself besieged by forces of the Golden Horde, a Mongol successor state commanded by Khan Janibeg. The Genoese excelled at defensive warfare and maintained maritime resupply lines, turning the siege into a brutal, months-long stalemate. Then, something invisible began decimating the Mongol army. Living in cramped conditions with inadequate sanitation, the besieging forces became a perfect incubation environment for the bacterium that had traveled with them from the east. Soldiers died by hundreds, then thousands, their bodies darkening with gangrene before death claimed them. The mighty army was dissolving not through enemy action, but through biological warfare they hadn't chosen. Watching his forces disintegrate and facing inevitable defeat, Janibeg made a decision that would echo through centuries. In an act of desperate biological terrorism, he commanded that corpses of plague-dead soldiers be loaded onto trebuchets and launched over Kaffa's walls. For days, the fortress endured a rain of putrefying bodies. Genoese defenders watched in horror as pestilent corpses smashed onto rooftops and into marketplaces. The psychological impact was devastating, but the biological consequences proved immediate and fatal. Bacteria carried in bodily fluids and fleas abandoning cold corpses for warm living hosts infiltrated the supposedly impregnable city. The fortress had been breached from within by an enemy no walls could stop. Panic seized Kaffa's population. Wealthy Genoese merchants, recognizing the city's doom, employed their greatest advantage: their ships. 12 galleys loaded with refugees, cargo, and unseen microscopic passengers slipped from the harbor, sailing past the dying Mongol army toward what they believed was safety. They passed through the Bosphorus, skirted Constantinople, which would soon face its own devastation, and entered the open Mediterranean. This sea represented Europe's economic engine, a zone of intense, rapid commerce. The fleeing vessels became mobile vectors of death, docking at major hubs for resupply, unwittingly seeding infection at every port. Messina in Sicily became the first major European port to fall. When Genoese galleys arrived, dock workers rowing out to meet them encountered a scene beyond nightmare. Contemporary accounts describe finding most sailors dead, bodies decomposing on deck, while the few survivors writhed in delirium, covered in black boils, leaking blood and pus from every orifice. Port authorities of Messina grasped too late the nature of what had arrived. They ordered immediate expulsion of the ships, but the true carriers of transmission, black rats ubiquitous on medieval vessels and their flea passengers, had already scurried down mooring ropes onto the docks. Messina became Europe's testing ground, and it failed catastrophically. Infection spread with paralyzing speed. The close-quarters living conditions of medieval port cities acted as accelerants. Within weeks, Messina's social fabric disintegrated completely. People fled toward the countryside, only spreading contagion further across the island. News of the great mortality spread, prompting other ports to attempt closing harbors to eastern ships. But the effort was futile, impossibly late. The pathogen had already established multiple beachheads across the Mediterranean basin. From Sicily, the plague radiated outward with terrifying efficiency. Genoa, Venice, Marseille, Barcelona fell in rapid succession. Ships unknowingly carried infection up the Atlantic coast to England and across the North Sea to Scandinavia. By 1348, the pestilence had penetrated deep into the European interior, following rivers, trade roads, and pilgrimage routes. No barrier could contain it. Mountains, rivers, winter cold, none provided protection. The bacterium adapted to multiple transmission methods. The most common form, bubonic plague, spread through flea bites, causing the characteristic swellings. But it could also manifest as pneumonic plague, spreading through respiratory droplets when victims coughed, allowing direct human-to-human transmission with even greater lethality. To truly grasp the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must understand the absolute terror of confronting such an enemy without modern scientific knowledge. The greatest medical minds of the 1400s, including doctors at the prestigious University of Paris, found themselves completely baffled. Their intellectual framework wasn't germ theory, but ancient Greek concepts of humors and miasma. They concluded that the air itself had become corrupted, perhaps by a rare planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that released toxic vapors from the Earth. Physicians advised against bathing, claiming it opened skin pores to corrupted air. They burned aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary on street corners to combat the overwhelming stench of death. They bled patients already severely weakened by disease. They lanced the buboes, which only accelerated septicemic infection throughout the bloodstream. Every rational attempt to combat the pestilence seemed only to feed its fury. The realization that humanity's accumulated knowledge was utterly powerless created a profound psychological crisis that rippled through every level of society. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian writer who witnessed Florence's devastation, a city that lost approximately 60% of its population, left haunting accounts of complete social collapse. The terror of contagion proved so overwhelming that the most fundamental human bonds shattered. Boccaccio described fathers abandoning dying sons, wives fleeing husbands gasping their final breaths alone in empty bedrooms. The sick were sealed inside their homes, left to perish without comfort or care. The intricate machinery of medieval urban life ground to a complete halt. Laws ceased to have meaning because no magistrates survived to enforce them. Courts closed their doors. Bakeries stopped producing bread. The characteristic sounds of bustling city life, cartwheels on cobblestones, merchants hawking goods, construction noise, all vanished, replaced by oppressive silence broken only by incessant church bells tolling death after death until the bell ringers themselves perished or authorities banned the practice to prevent mass panic. Corpses accumulated faster than burial could occur. Consecrated churchyard ground filled completely, forcing the excavation of massive plague pits, deep trenches where bodies were stacked in layers like cordwood, separated only by thin dustings of soil. The scale of death exceeded anything in human memory or historical record. In 1400 society, no separation existed between physical and spiritual reality. An event of such apocalyptic scale could only represent direct divine punishment, God chastising humanity for its manifold sins of greed, pride, and corruption. The Church, which formed the bedrock of medieval existence, faced an impossible test. Terrified populations flooded cathedrals, praying desperately for deliverance. massing together in religious processions that only served to accelerate spread of the respiratory pneumonic form. When prayers failed and priests died just as rapidly as sinners, a desperate radical piety emerged across the continent. The flagellant movement swept through northern Europe like wildfire. Bands of hundreds of men dressed in identical robes marched from town to town, performing ritualized self-torture. Twice daily in public squares, they stripped to the waist and whipped themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, drawing blood in spectacular displays of penance, hoping to absorb the world's sins onto their own flesh and appease divine wrath. They brought religious hysteria wherever they appeared, a terrifying sight that somehow seemed appropriate for the times. But as the death toll mounted relentlessly with no end in sight, the desperate search for tangible scapegoats took a horrific turn. If God wasn't listening, perhaps the devil was actively at work. A murderous conspiracy theory took root, particularly throughout the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Spain, claiming that Jewish communities were systematically poisoning Christian wells to exterminate the faithful. Despite official condemnations by Pope Clement VI, who logically pointed out that Jews were dying of plague at identical rates as Christians, mob mentality overwhelmed reason. Fueled by centuries of existing anti-Semitism and desperate need to blame someone tangible, horrific pogroms erupted across dozens of cities. Entire Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive in wooden structures or public squares. Thousands murdered in spasms of violence that represented humanity at its absolute darkest. The Black Death unleashed not merely biological horror, but exposed the most monstrous aspects of human nature when fear overwhelms civilization. It would be a mistake to view the plague as purely an urban phenomenon. While cities served as epicenters, 90% of medieval Europe's population lived in rural areas, and the pestilence reached them too, carried by refugees fleeing infected cities or traveling peddlers. The devastation in countryside regions progressed more slowly, but proved perhaps more profound in its long-term consequences. Thousands of small villages, whose names have vanished from historical memory, were completely erased from existence. The manorial system, which depended on steady supplies of peasant labor to work aristocratic lands, collapsed completely. Contemporary accounts describe haunting rural scenes, crops rotting unharvested in fields because no laborers remained alive to gather them. Herds of sheep and cattle wandered aimlessly through the landscape, eventually turning feral or dying from neglect because every shepherd had perished. Wolves, emboldened by the sudden absence of human presence, began encroaching on the few remaining settlements. The carefully cultivated medieval landscape was being reclaimed by wilderness, civilization retreating before nature's advance. By 1350, the plague had penetrated the northernmost reaches of the continent, devastating Scotland, Scandinavia, and even the tiny Norse settlements of Greenland, delivering a death blow to colonies that would soon vanish entirely. It had consumed the entire continent, from the warm Mediterranean shores to the frozen northern territories. By 1351, the initial catastrophic wave began exhausting itself. The bacterium had simply depleted its supply of easily accessible victims. The fog of death gradually lifted, revealing a continent utterly transformed. The precise death toll will never be known with certainty, but modern historians estimate between 75 and 200 million people perished across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, approximately 50% of the entire population died in less than 5 years, a demographic catastrophe without parallel in recorded history. The survivors emerged into a world that superficially appeared unchanged, but was fundamentally different in every meaningful way. The immediate aftermath brought economic chaos and severe inflation as goods became scarce. But then something remarkable occurred that would reshape society for centuries. The massive depopulation created an acute labor shortage. For the first time in living memory, peasants held genuine power. Lords, desperate to have their lands worked, were forced to offer substantially higher wages and dramatically improved conditions. The rigid structures of serfdom, which had bound peasants to land for generations, cracked under pressure, and in many regions eventually shattered completely. A golden age for laborers emerged, born directly from ashes of unprecedented death. Yet psychological scars ran impossibly deep. Art became obsessed with mortality. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a dominant cultural motif, depicting skeletons leading kings, popes, and peasants alike to their graves, a stark reminder that death remained the ultimate equalizer, regardless of earthly status or wealth. The plague represented the greatest collective trauma Western civilization has ever endured. It shattered the optimism and confidence of the High Middle Ages and demonstrated the terrible fragility of human systems when confronted with nature's raw power. The society that rebuilt itself emerged more cynical, more questioning of traditional authority, forced to adapt and innovate simply to survive. The labor shortage accelerated technological innovation as fewer workers needed more efficient tools. The weakening of feudal bonds contributed to the gradual rise of individual rights and eventually democratic institutions. The questioning of church authority that intensified during the Plague years laid groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. Universities shifted focus toward empirical observation, planting seeds for the scientific revolution. In the end, the path of death we have traced cleared ground for the slow, painful emergence of the modern world. For centuries afterward, the Black Death was treated as a distant medieval nightmare, safely confined to history books. But empty streets, locked homes, fear of the very air we breathe, does that truly sound like ancient history? Or does it feel disturbingly familiar? Recent events have demonstrated that pandemics remain existential threats to human civilization, that our interconnected world, just like the medieval trade networks, can spread catastrophe with breathtaking speed. The plague was a test of civilization's resilience, its capacity to endure unimaginable loss and somehow continue. Tests, however, have a tendency to repeat themselves in new forms. The lessons carved in mass graves across medieval Europe remain urgently relevant. Our vulnerability to invisible biological threats hasn't disappeared simply because we possess modern medicine. The same human behaviors that spread the Black Death, panic, scapegoating, social breakdown, still lurk beneath civilization's surface, waiting for sufficient pressure to re-emerge. Understanding this history isn't merely academic exercise, but vital preparation for challenges that inevitably lie ahead. The medieval world died in agony, but from its ashes rose the foundations of everything we recognize as modernity. A transformation born from the greatest catastrophe humanity has ever faced.